Hello everyone and welcome back to my Warhammer 40k guides. I am Brady and today I would like to give you some tips and tricks for melee armies. Like I mentioned in my previous videos, I've seen a decent amount of complaints from people who claim that melee is in a bad spot and that gun lines are too strong. Well, in this video I aim to give my opinions on the matter and explain why I feel melee is actually stronger than shooting in some regards when it is done right. And I also aim to explain how to actually pilot your melee armies to get the most bang for your buck and get as many advantages as you possibly can with your melee units. Before we get into the main topic of this video was sponsored by the magnetbaron.com. They offer magnets of all sizes, magnetized movement trays, and magnetized flight stands. So if you're looking at picking up some magnets for your hobbying needs, then check out the magnetbaron.com. I will have a link to their website in the description. So let's talk about melee and why it's not as bad as some people think. First off, let me say that I am talking about competitive Warhammer 40k and when it's played at a competitive level. In casual games, I can understand why casual players are struggling with melee because they might not understand all of the little tricks that you can do to get the most out of the charge and fight phases. Shooting is by far much easier to pull off on a casual level because it only really requires good target priority and a tiny bit of board control, and not much else. And while even if you have good target priority for melee, you can still not gain as much because of screening units and the enemy being able to fall back for free, which allows your melee units to be gunned down after their charge. So in this video, I plan on explaining some of the things you should know when playing a melee army to get the most out of it. Some of the things I'm about to mention are in older videos of mine, but I figured it was about time I put all of the information into one video for the community. Also, with the release of the Orcs Codex, I figured this was a perfect time to make this video. So unlike shooting, melee can actually lock down units and stop them from shooting, unless that unit has the fly keyword, in which case it can fall back from combat and still shoot normally. Sure, you could argue I can stop a unit from doing anything by killing it with shooting, which technically is correct, but in melee, you can stop a unit by shooting by killing it, and then you can consolidate into a second unit to stop that unit from shooting as well, and this can be done with only one unit of your own. And depending on the placement of units, you can actually stop multiple units from being useful with one unit that charged. So again, in this regard, melee has the potential to be much stronger than shooting when it comes to locking down the opponent, as long as their stuff doesn't have the fly keyword. You could also argue, well, they could just pull back those units from combat and then shoot you with everything else because fallbacks are free. To which I would say yes, that is a possibility, but only if your positioning of your melee unit wasn't optimal, because you can do something that actually stops this. I heard the phrase coined on different forums, so I will use the term that I've read, and that is taking a hostage. Taking a hostage is a fancy way of saying surround one unit or model with your unit so it cannot fall back unless it has the fly keyword. And most stuff in the game doesn't have the fly keyword, so this works more often than not. Sometimes it's easy to take a hostage and other times it's not. But this depends on both players, the dice rolls, and the skill of each player, which I think is good. Here's an example of taking a hostage. These orc boys are charging this guard squad, and like boys do, they annihilate the guard squad. Now when it comes to your consolidation move, you take your boys and move them to the closest enemy model. In this case, it will be the guardsman unit that is right beside the unit that you just killed. You can take a few boys and surround one model in that unit so it cannot leave combat. Therefore, you have now taken a hostage and are safe from shooting on the next turn. And because melee works for both players in both turns, on your opponent's turn, your boys then wipe out that unit of guardsmen that you took hostage, and then on your next turn, they have the freedom to charge again and repeat the process. Positioning is key when it comes to this, so let me explain a little bit further on how to better position in order to accomplish this, because most of the time it's not going to be this cut and dry, and it will take some problem solving skills to figure out the best way to take a hostage. Let's say there is no second unit that is close enough for you to surround. Well, you could position your unit in such a way that you minimize the casualties from the original charge, which means the unit you charge will still most likely be intact, so you can surround that unit. So let's go back to the example of the boys and the guardsmen, but let's change the way we charge. So as you can see, in this charge, I've surrounded the unit, but I've only put one boy in combat range. This is a legal move because the only requirement to charging is that the first model you move has to end within 1 inch of the charge target. But other than that, your models can go their charge distance in any direction as long as they keep coherency. So you do this because that one orc boy can't possibly kill the entire squad by himself, and you won't do enough damage to make the guard squad run away due to failed morale. There will at least be a couple left even if they do fail the morale. This means that when you consolidate after you're done attacking with that one boy, you can surround the rest of the models that are left in that squad. This then means that on your opponent's turn, you can then kill that squad, and then on your next turn be free to charge and repeat the process again. And again, you do this kind of stuff because when you've taken a hostage, your unit cannot be shot at because it is in close combat. Sure, there are a couple of armies in the game that are allowed to shoot into close combat, but they are super rare, so you're hardly ever going to have to deal with that. Here's another thing you can do in the charge phase that can net you some really big advantages. When you charge, again, the only requirement is that your first model has to end within 1 inch of a unit that it declared a charge against. So in this example, we have a guard infantry unit with a couple of tanks beside them. These are Punisher Leman Russes and can do a ton of damage to your boys through Overwatch, so it's best to not charge them and lose guys to Overwatch. So in this case, you charge the infantry squad. Then move your first model to be within 1 inch of the infantry squad. And then you can move the rest of your models with moving some of them a little over 1 inch away from the tanks. Because again, you didn't declare them as a charge target, so you technically can't end your charge move within 1 inch of them. You can end just outside of 1 inch though. Now when it comes to your pile-in moves, your models have to move to the nearest enemy model. So in this case, some are closer to the guardsmen, while other are closer to the tanks. So now you move the models into combat with the tanks. This allowed you to avoid Overwatch from those tanks, but still get into combat with them. Now notice in this example specifically, when I move these models, I do move them closer, but I do not move them into base contact with the tank yet. Because again, it just states that you have to end your move closer to them. It doesn't say that you have to end as close as possible to them. So, and I'm doing this for a reason that I'll get into in a second. So my models near the tank that started outside of 1 inch from the tank are now slightly within 1 inch of the tank after their pile-in move. Meaning, they did move closer to the nearest enemy model, and this is a legal move. And now you do your attacks. But remember, you can't attack the tanks because you didn't declare them as a charge target. But that's okay. You still tied them up so they can't shoot next turn, and you can possibly save your boys from being shot at by those tanks if you end up getting a hostage after this. So let's continue with this example. And now after your attacks are finished, you annihilate the guard squad, and then you consolidate with the rest of your models. So with the same tactics we used for piling in, we now surround one of the tanks and tie the other one up as well. Because again, we're moving closer to the nearest enemy model. We don't have to go directly in a straight line towards it and get into base contact. If we're 9 millimeters away from the tank and we move our consolidation and we measure 8 millimeters away from the tank, we've moved closer. So that was a legal move. So with one unit of 30 boys in this example, we've essentially murdered a guard squad and tied up 2 Leman Russes so they can't shoot next turn, and surrounded one of those Leman Russes, which stops the enemy army from being able to shoot your boys on their turn. So when we break it down, you just used around 200 points to kill 40 points and make another 300 something points useless for their next turn, which is a good trade, while also protecting your 200 points because they can't shoot your boys because they have that tank as a hostage. Now keep in mind though, just because I have a feeling I'm going to get some comments in the comment section saying this, surrounding a Leman Russ with your boys isn't necessarily the best idea, because not only are you keeping that Leman Russ hostage, but that Leman Russ in a way is keeping your boys hostage, because your boys don't really have the strength to kill that Leman Russ on your opponent's turn, which means you're going to have to leave your boys there for a turn or two. So you're going to have to think about these kind of things when you're taking a hostage. If you can kill that unit, and if you can't, if it's going to take multiple turns to do it, can you afford to have your boys doing that for multiple turns? Or maybe on the next turn, you can smite that thing to death and then free up your boys to go charge other things. Or maybe you have a Death Dread right behind that can charge the Leman Russ to save your boys and get them out of combat. There's so many variables to think about. So this example was more or less just to show you things you can do, not necessarily things you should do. So with that said, I hope I clear a couple of things up. Last thing I would like to mention about taking hostages are units that only have one model, like a War Boss or a Def Killa War Trike. These units by themselves cannot trap an enemy model in combat because they don't have enough models to do so. They're a one model unit. So in this case, you would need to combine 2 or more units with one model to trap something and take a hostage. But to be honest, stuff like War Bosses are meant to give the killing blow on the charge. So you save those units for actually killing stuff on the charge, and use multiple model units like boys to take a hostage. And with rules like the character keyword rules, as long as your positioning is good, you can have a war boss wide out in the open that can't be targeted by your opponents because the boys squad that is in between them who took a hostage is stopping them through the character keyword. So use your multi-model units to tie stuff up and keep units like your war boss safe through good positioning until it's time to charge and get some actual damage done. So as you can see, these examples are all situational. It depends on your opponent's deployment, the length of the charge distance, and the skill of both players. But if done correctly, you can essentially shut down your opponent's entire gun line with a few good charges while making sure that your units are pretty much immune to being shot. There are many other ways to do this with charges as well, but I think I've gave you guys enough examples so you can try to implement this way of thinking in your future games. Charging is an amazing way to shut down most gun lines. You don't necessarily have to kill the gun line to make it useless. You just need to bad touch their units so that they won't be able to shoot for at least one turn, which could be enough to give you an advantage to swing the game into your favor. This is why melee has constantly been nerfed, because high-level players do this stuff all day and essentially shut down their opponents with some good charging tactics. At a casual level, this stuff rarely happens, which is why casual players normally disagree that charges in melee are that strong, but high-level players could abuse these rules to sometimes win games on turn 1 or 2 against gun lines with some well-thought-out charges. Back to tactics though, there are a couple of things to consider when taking hostage. And the first thing is the damage potential of the unit that you've taken a hostage. Let's say your boys trapped a guardsman. They are most likely not going to lose any models, and even if they do, they'll probably lose 1 or 2. Unless the guard are Katachan backed up by Strachan and a priest. And in that case, your boys are probably going to get hit back pretty hard. So essentially, it's hard to take units hostage that are good in melee because they hit back too hard. So for another example, if your boys took a squad of enemy berserkers as hostages, well, the berserkers are just going to hit you back pretty hard, and those enemy berserkers are going to get themselves a nice advantage by killing a lot of your boys. So be wary about the units that you're taking hostage and their damage potential in the fight phase. Taking hostages really only works against shooting units or severely weakened melee units. The second thing to consider when taking hostages is the charge potential your opponent has with their army. If you're playing against a Chaos army and you try to take hostages against them, well, they're just going to have a bunch of units that can countercharge your unit and get their advantage back. So again, taking hostages really only works against shooting armies, but it does work against melee armies, but it really depends on the situation and everything, like the placement of other armies, whether you're going to be in charge distance of their stuff. There's a lot of variables that go into thinking like this. And all of that will just come with time and experience after you've tried this out a few times. So like I mentioned earlier about shooting versus melee, shooting can shut down your opponent by killing units, while melee can shut down the opponent by killing units or tying them up to make them useless. You can also tie up multiple units with one unit. In certain situations, you can actually have one cheap unit tie up the entire enemy gun line to make it useless. More often than not, these situations won't come up, but the potential is there. So like for this example that you see here, there's a bunch of guard tanks and one infantry squad. I can take my 30 boys, declare a charge against a guard unit, but then daisy chain all of my orcs in such a way so that when I go to pile in and then consolidate, I'm going to touch all of these tanks, and now the enemy's gun line is completely useless because of one unit and one charge move. So now you're probably saying, well Brady, sure, if I get into combat I can tie some stuff up and do some stuff, but what if I get shot off the board before I get there? And to that I will say you are entirely correct. If you get shot off the board before you get into combat, then you obviously aren't going to win the game. But there are ways to make it easier for you to get your guys into combat, which I will explain now. The first method is the horde method. A ton of bodies. If you bring 200 orc boys, but your opponent only has 60 guns, then realistically, you're going to get your armies into combat because your opponent doesn't have nearly enough shots to wipe you off the board. You combine this with support units like a pain boy who gives a feel no pain to your boys, and also utilizing the mob rule to keep your boys' leadership high enough that you don't lose a mass amount of boys to leadership. You can then also bring stuff like a Big Mech that gives a 5-up invulnerable save to all your boys to make them even more resilient, and you can include other units that support the boys defensively as well. For some other melee armies, you can play Chaos and bring a ton of cultists backed up by Abaddon who makes them fearless, or an Iron Warriors warlord who can take the fearless trait and make your cultists fearless as well. Or Plague Bearers and buff them to be -1 to hit with a 4+ invul. Or Zangors, who can also become -1 to hit with a 4+ invul. With Tyranids, you can use Synapse and that spell that gives them a 5-up Feel No Pain. Or with Space Wolves, you can use a Rune Priest to increase your saves by 1 and then use the stratagem to make all those units -1 to hit as well. The key to getting into combat is utilizing these defensive synergies that make your guys more durable. Fearless hordes like Tyranids or Chaos, or buffing up elite units like Space Wolves are really great examples of how to get your little guys into combat with minimal casualties. Also, another way to get your units into combat is through Deep Strike. If you go this route though, I recommend only using units that have some sort of bonus to their charge. For example, if you have demons, you can get +1 to their charge roll through a demonic instrument. Or Bloodletters, who can have an upgraded banner to give them a 3d6 charge. Or Blood Angels with their stratagem that gives them a 3d6 charge. Or Evil Sun's Orcs, who gets +1 on the charge and can re-roll their charge if needed. If you have to charge the normal 9 inches out of Deep Strike with no bonuses, then odds are you aren't going to get into combat that turn and be shot down on the following turn. So make sure if you use the Deep Strike way of getting into combat that your guys have reliable ways to actually make that charge out of Deep Strike. And the third way, which is the least reliable way in my opinion, is to use terrain in your advantage. The reason I say that this method isn't as reliable as the other ways to get your army into combat safely is because at tournaments you don't really have a say on what terrain is on the board and where that terrain is at. And sometimes you might end up on tables that don't have good terrain for blocking line of sight, or terrain that doesn't really give cover saves like hills. But if you notice you have a good board for competitive with good terrain, you can utilize the terrain to hide behind on your way to combat. And that pretty much covers it for most of the tips that I wanted to give, or at least the main tips. But I do still have a few other useful tips for the fight and charge phase, which I will cover quickly before I end this video. Don't forget about heroic interventions. Your characters can essentially charge on your opponent's turn if they are within 3 inches of an enemy model at the end of the charge phase. This does not mean within 3 inches of a unit that charged. It means within 3 inches of any enemy unit. So even if your opponent doesn't declare any charges on that turn, but your characters are within 3 inches of enemy models, they can still perform heroic interventions to get themselves into combat. You can use this to gain some really good advantages in your games. So in melee vs melee, trading units becomes more important, and the game pretty much becomes a game of chess at that point. You don't want your war boss to charge some cultists, to kill those cultists, but then get charged by the enemy demon prince on the following turn, and you lose your war boss. This would be the equivalent of having your queen kill a pawn, only to be killed by the enemy queen. So instead, you have your little units battle it out, and then countercharge with your good units after your opponent sends in their good units. Or if you outplay them through positioning, and you can guarantee that your war boss is safe from charges with the screen or just being far enough away, then feel free to use your queen to kill a pawn, as long as your queen is going to be safe on the following turn. Also, with the way that charging works, like I mentioned earlier, you only need one model to end within an inch of the charge target. You can then move the rest of your guys anywhere you want as long as they stay within coherency. You can also use this to keep your units in buff ranges from your support units. For example, if you really need to kill your charge target with some berserkers, you can have a couple of guys stay back in conga line to stay within a reroll ones bubble from a Chaos Lord or a Demon Prince, or they can stay within the bubble of an Exalted Champion to reroll failed wounds. So remember that you can conga line and do things like this to keep your units in aura buffs. And then the last thing I would like to mention is that you should always bring some guns. I know this video is about how to win with melee armies, but like I've said in past videos, I firmly believe good lists incorporate elements of shooting, psychic, and melee. Sometimes you need some anti-infantry to clear up the screens for better charge targets, or sometimes you want some anti-tank guns to get rid of the things that hide behind the enemy screen. Bringing guns might also mess up your opponent's target priority because of their shooting. Because if they target your shooting unit because it's an immediate threat, then that gives your melee units more time to move up the board. And if they target your closest melee unit because that seems like a bigger threat, then your guns are still going to be doing damage from afar. You don't have to bring a full-on gun line to support your melee army, but at least bring a few ranged elements to help support your melee units. If you do go full melee, however, you are heavily relying on the tricks I mentioned in this video to keep your guys alive and to get as many advantages as possible. And although they are good tricks, they can be shut down by your opponent with good positioning or bad charge rolls. And that about covers everything you need to know for how to win games with a melee army. That's going to be it for this video. If you've enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more Warhammer 40k content like this. And leave a comment down below to let me know what you guys think about this subject. Also, if you want to help support the channel even further, you can check me out on Patreon. For a pledge of $5, you get access to the Almost Pro Gaming Discord channel that has tons of people to discuss the game with. And it also includes basic coaching and list advice from myself. So it's a great place to learn some stuff to up your competitive game, or even so you can just play your casual games a bit more strategically. If you don't care about the coaching or the Discord, but you just want to help support the channel even further, and to allow me to continue making videos like this, then consider pledging on Patreon for that as well. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope this video helps you guys pilot your melee armies to victory. Thanks again for watching, and happy wargaming.